Hello, everyone, and welcome to the live FICHEF Wine Talk. My name is Wolfgang Junglas. I'm the president of FICHEF, the International Federation of Wine and Spirit Journalists and Writers. Our subject is viticulture in Israel, history and up-to-date information about a fascinating wine culture. Experts from the Holy Land will enlighten us to how wine growing is done under Mediterranean conditions. My dear friend and FICHEF member, Sagi Cooper, will give us now an introduction to viticulture in Israel. Sagi, we met first in 2015 at the Michelangelo Wine Award in Stellenbosch, where we both were judges. You have been writing about wine and spirits since 2000, and you have published several books and co-authored the Comprehensive Guide to Israeli Wines. Sagi, what can you tell us about the history of wine growing in Israel?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Wolfgang. And so wine in Israel, it's actually wine in the Holy Land or wherever. And I don't have a lot of time here. It's just 8 minutes, as we said, and I have to cover about 4,000 years of winemaking. So better get on with this. Some basics. Israel, the Holy Land, the Palestine, call it what you want, is part of the Fertile Crescent, and as such has been a source of wine since very early ages. It's divided in several regions. This is the official wine map of Israel, and what's unique here is that it's a very long and narrow country. So you have lots of microclimate or micro zones, which make things interesting. We don't know when things started, but we do have things evident from about 4,000 years ago. This is a Canaanite palace that was found and dug out in quite a number of years ago. And there were rooms there to prepare wine, to prepare jugs, to clean them and so on. And the archaeologists counted enough jars to hold about 2,000 liters of wine. This is 4,000 years ago. It's been very well preserved. Of course, we don't have wine, but they did try to find out what these people drank and couldn't, as far as I know. 2,000 years ago, the industry gets a little bit larger. This is already at King Herod's palace in Herodion, that's not too far from Jerusalem. And these jugs here, and there were tens of them, each hold about 1,000 liters. And if you take this into account, then Herod must have drank a lot of wine and his guests were pretty well covered. And we don't know exactly how many jars were there, but the assumption is in between 40,000 liters at any given time. That's 2,000 years ago. Then about 1,500 years ago, this is the peak of the wine industry in the Holy Land. This is in the desert. It's not far from Yatir. And what you see here is a wine press from Byzantine times. This is more or less when the industry peaked. Then it fell quite sharply due to two events. One is the Justinianic plague in the 6th century, and the other one is, of course, the Islamic conquest of the Holy Land, which severed all the contacts, all the connections we had with Europe. So there was no more export market, and of course, there were no more pilgrims, and people stopped more or less drinking wine. Things changed again about 150 years ago with Carmel, which was the first real modern winery to manufacture table wine. Until then, there were mostly sacramental wines or sacramental wine wineries, small ones in Jerusalem and around Jerusalem. And this is Baron de Rothschild's works here in Zichron and Rishon LeZion. Rishon LeZion is near Tel Aviv. It's not far from Tel Aviv. It's in the center of Israel. And Zichron is near Haifa in the northern part. And the guy you see here, this little guy here, the cellar hand is David Ben-Gurion, who would later become the first prime minister of Israel. So it's it was a pretty important winery. The Golan Heights Winery is what we call the second revolution of winemaking in Israel. After about 100 years of monopoly by Carmel, the Golan Heights Winery was established in Katzrin, and it is, as it was, a very terroir and quality-oriented winery rather than Carmel, that was oriented mostly on table, low-end, and sacramental wines. The second revolution, or what happened 25 years ago, is quite interesting. And what we see is sort of boutique winery revolution. There are many boutique winemaker or boutique wineries established around about 2000, 2005. And we are around now, we are about 300, or there are about 300 wineries in Israel. Of course, not all of them are commercial, but still there are. It's interesting to see that the new wine areas that were defined by the young winemakers of today, let's say, correlate very nicely with all these ancient wine presses that we see across the country. Here in the Golan Heights, if you can see my cursor, in the Golan Heights, you see small dots. This is where wine presses are. And this is one of the wine regions today. And here along the shore, there is another region. And here in Zichron Yaakov, or in the vicinity of Haifa, and again in the desert. I think I'm more or less about on time here. So I just want to wrap it up. This is the map. Someone did a very nice map of the wineries in Israel. So there are about 320 of them. And you can always come and visit once this plague is over and the skies open again. If you have any questions, you are more than welcome to write to me. And of course, the presentation will be available online in my site at this particular web address.
Dear Sagi, thank you very much. I must admit, I didn't know all that. It's quite fascinating. What does interest me as well is how important is wine consumption in society, in everyday culture in Israel?
The per capita wine consumption is about 4.5 to 5 liters. It depends on who's counting and how. It's very important to religious people. It's part of there are no sacraments in Judaism, but it's part of the religious sacrament, let's put it this way. So wine does have a lot of importance.
So when people from Israel go out into a restaurant, what are they ordered to drink with their dinner? Will it be wine or beer then?
Oh, it depends on the age and the opportunity. Wine in restaurants is sadly very expensive. Maybe not as expensive in Germany, but it's pretty expensive. So people tend to drink less in restaurants. But it's becoming, wine by the glass has become sort of a good thing now. So maybe this will add up to the consumption once the restaurants are all open and people begin to, hang out again as they used to.
There has been a tradition, a long tradition of twin towns between Germany and Israel for decades. And in 2008, Twin Wineries was founded, where it has been largely responsible for connecting the wine producers of these two countries. In 2017, I had the honor of, as the president of the German Wine Journalist Federation, Weinfeder, to hand over the German Wine Critics Award to the founder of Twin Wineries, René Salzmann. René is here with us tonight. René, could you please tell us more about Twin Wineries?
Very much, Wolfgang, for giving me the opportunity to present the Twin Wineries. The Twin Wineries was founded in 2008. And in fact, it's all about German and Israel. It's a partnership between German and Israeli winemakers. It also encourages an understanding better the two cultures who have a very long history. and also promote know-how and continued education, of course, building friendships, that's at the essence of it, and assists also in promoting wines of both countries. And finally, it's a lot of fun drinking each other's wine. So the tricky thing about the twin wineries is to make the perfect match, to find the right match between a German winery and its people and an Israeli winery. And there I would like to mention and to thank my partner Eva Raps, who from the winery Kaufmann in the Rheingau, who is a twin, but also the speaker of the German winery, of the German twin wineries. After a whole process of matchmaking, each twin receives a brass that it will place in its visitor center to allow everyone to see and attest to this partnership and start to ask questions about it. As you can see in the next slide, we have some of the very best twins. There are 20 twin partners or 40 wineries in Israel and Germany. Now, I will have to repeat, as it is in my presentation, it was founded in March 2008 in Düsseldorf, immediately after ProWein. And the first three wineries, twins, the first three twins were Heimann, Löwenstein, and Margalit, and then Moosbacher and Wittkin, as well as Breuer and Galil Mountain, the sister winery of Golden Heights Winery. Now, quickly after that, many more twins joined, as you will see here. Kloster Eberbach, I will name only the Germans, S.A. Prüm, Weingut Kaufmann, Schloss Westerhaus, and Stenner as well. Now, in order to foster this relationship and continue the friendship, we have organized all kinds of events. One of them is the mutual visits, both in Germany and in Israel. This is, of course, in Germany, but in Israel. And there were many, it is in Golden Heights, by the way, Geisenheim, as you can see, but also in the southern part of, we also organized mutual tastings at ProWein. We used the opportunity, as the German twins as well as the Israeli twins were there in an Israeli booth. So people could taste at the same time the German wine as well as the Israeli wine. Also, another sub-project was the creation of, or the development and production of kosher wines in Germany. Von Hövel, Nick Weiss, St. Urbanshof in the Mosel with Rieslings, and in Franconia, it is Hans Wirsching with the Silvaner. Now, many other things we did was also tastings. You had the tastings, which you will see in a moment, in wine tastings, wine evenings, in the Rutzbar Berlin, there were in Bergisch Gladbach, as well as cultural days in Trier, and a wine evening as well in Mainz. From that, we wanted to enlarge the attention to the twin wineries, and we started a series of masterclasses. Here are just two of them. The first one was in Munich, under the auspices of the General Consulate, Israeli General Consulate, and this is in the BMW world. And the second one was in Frankfurt. And as you can see, Romana Eschensberger, you just saw her, she, Master of Wine, she is, I would say, sort of like an ambassador for Israeli wines in Germany. She does all the moderation and is fully familiar, having visited Israel for so many times. We also collaborated with Vinissima, the women's organization, and did a tasting of wines for the twin wineries. And this is not the end yet. We also participated and collaborated with the Rheingau Gourmet Wine Festival, which takes place at the Rheingau, of course, with tastings in the afternoon and a gala dinner in the evening where German and Israeli wines were presented. An interesting thing was also that the politicians started to discover the Twin Wineries initiative, in particular, that private persons can do so much for bringing the two cultures, the two people together. So here we have members of the North Rhine-Westphalia Parliament who participated at ProWein at a press conference in 2015. And also in Bavaria, they became interested and organized a Bavarian-Israeli friendship evening. However, we wanted to enhance even more and to create more awareness, and created in 2014 the first German-Israeli wine summit at Kloster Eberbach. And all the Israeli twins came to Germany, and it was a wonderful event with lots of success. And the second one was the year after, in 2015, in the Tulip Winery in Israel. And again, we had many people, all the German twins came to Israel and were there. Finally, as Wolfgang already said, we were very, very honored to receive in 2017. Would you imagine, Wolfgang, already 4 years ago, the German Wine Critics Award in Mainz. And finally, in 2018, we celebrated the third German-Israeli Wine Summit, which coincided with the 10th anniversary of the Twin Wineries and the 70th anniversary of the State of Israel in Berlin. And we had planned 2 years later, every 2 years, we had planned last year to do it in Israel, but unfortunately, due to Corona, we were not able. As you can see, the family of the twins has grown, the audience has grown, and it's a real delight to see how everybody is enjoying themselves and how many friendships have been built. This is the most important. And also a friendship I acknowledge very much is with Jürgen Sterzenbach, who has been the very faithful soul since the beginning of the Twin Wineries and taken care of all the PR.
Thank you very, very much, Renee, for that interesting, it looks like a family picture book. And I think the relationship between Germany and Israel is a very special one. And me personally, I'm very happy that this Twin Wineries does exist, because I think wine is something that can bring cultures together. I would like to know, is the German wine market interesting for Israelis?
Definitely, it's very interesting. Although the competition is incredibly big, as you know, not only in Germany, but from all the countries in the world. But, you know, like in every country, but in Germany in particular, I would say, it is something exotic. It is something new for Germans. And it's different, and then it's Israeli.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Renee. Winemakers from Israel will now tell you more about their wine growing region and their winery. The first one is Victor Schönfeld from Golan Heights Winery. Victor has been working there as a head winemaker since 30 years, which is quite a long time. He is responsible for 230 hectares of vineyards. I think in Germany, we have complete wine regions who have 230 hectares. So that is really a big size. Victor, the Golan Heights has almost the same ideal conditions in terms of soil and climate as Bordelais or Tuscany. You have worked in France. Is wine growing in your region similar?
Thank you for having me tonight. It's a pleasure to be here. There are definitely some similarities. If I had to pick between Bordeaux and Tuscany, we'd be a little bit more similar to Tuscany. Bordeaux, being maritime climate, would be much different than the climate that we have in the Golan Heights and in Israel in general, so quite a bit different.
So what are you telling us about the Golan Heights winery?
Okay, so I have 8 minutes, I'm going to throw a lot of information at you. I'm a big fan of Israeli wines in general, and it's an honor to present with the other Israelis here tonight. You might get the impression that there are only men in the Israeli wine industry from this evening, but that's not true. At our winery, we also have 2 women winemakers. We have a woman viticulturist and 2 women vineyard managers. So they're also obviously a very important part of our industry. So here's a picture of the northern Golan Heights at harvest time. And you can see in the picture the volcanoes, the cinder cones that form the Golan Heights. You can see some of the original forest, which is mostly oak forest, which was cut down mostly during the Ottoman Empire rule in the area. And you can see a lot of vineyards. For people that aren't familiar with our wines, we're most well known for our Yarden wines, but we also have Gamla and Hermon wines. Of course, we export all over the world. We have big markets in Europe, in Asia, Japan. I've been to Japan 10 times because that's a major market of ours. And I just took prices off Vivino just to give you kind of an idea of the range of prices that we're working with, price per bottle. Probably our most iconic wine is Yarden Cabernet Sauvignon, which runs in the mid $30 range. So if we look at Israel at a glance, and I have to give a little bit of background here. This is an old map here from Rogov's Guide to Israeli Wines. But as Sagi said, we're a tiny country, but the interesting thing about Israel is that we have the diversity in climate and geography of a large country. And I think a lot of first-time visitors to Israel actually find that shocking to see that those big differences in very short areas. So to put in perspective, we're about 3% the size of France. Here, a world map, we're in the Eastern Mediterranean here. And our placement is very important because if you think about the intersection between Europe, Asia, and Africa, it would be pretty much where we're located. So we're a tiny country, but we have these big forces pulling us in different directions. We sit on the Syrian-African Rift, and because of our placement here, we're one of the largest flyways of migrating birds in the world. 500 million birds fly over Israel twice a year. Yeah, it's a great place to bird watch, storks and cranes here in the picture. As we get closer in, just to think about that diversity, why isn't this? We have some of the most southern Mediterranean climate in the Northern Hemisphere, and we have the most northern tropical coral reefs in the Gulf of Eilat. So again, kind of this weird position on the planet. We're zooming in here a little bit more. Precipitation range from 23 millimeters in Eilat to 1,600 millimeters on the top of Mount Hermon. So we're getting closer here, Israel. We're seeing the Golan Heights here. These little colored dots you see are our vineyards coming into view. So in terms of elevation, minus 400 meters below sea level at the Dead Sea, up to 2,200 meters in the highest peak of the Israeli Mount Hermon. And here's the Sea of Galilee, the Golan Heights here, which kind of looks like an ear. And this is our vineyard sites, going from about 400 meters in elevation in the south up to close to 1,200 meters in elevation in the north. And the winery is located in Katzrin, and this is a half an hour drive, and this is a half an hour drive. So smack in the middle of our wine region. As you said, Wolfgang, we manage directly 230 hectares of vineyards, and we have long-term contracts with an additional 370. So we're not a small producer. We work with 600 hectares of vineyards, which are divided up into more than 400 vineyard blocks, which we monitor individually. So the Golan Heights is volcanic, and we all know there's wines being made from volcanic areas around the world. Mediterranean climate, obviously, there's a high correlation between Mediterranean climate and wine production. In terms of the origins of wines, we think it's here, which is only about 1,000 kilometers from where we are. So we think wine quickly came to the Eastern Mediterranean, then spread west. In terms of the Golan Heights, I think, Sagi, maybe this was the map you showed. There's been about 60 ancient wine presses found in the Golan Heights, so we're far from being the first people to produce wine, obviously, in the Golan Heights. This is our average rainfall by month. The gray is the average and the blue is what we had in millimeters per month leading up to last vintage. So a meteorologist would look at this graph and say, okay, classic Mediterranean climate, cold, wet winters, warm, dry summers. So in our 14 weather stations that we have, our average, long-term average is 614 millimeters, but the higher elevation vineyards have more and the lower elevations have a bit less. This is vapor pressure deficit, which is combining temperature and humidity. These numbers mean the higher you go, the more stressful the environment. So the hotter and drier it is. And 3.5 is used around the world as kind of a number that is below that is not very stressful to the vine. Above that, it starts being stressful. But anybody that works with this kind of data would look at this graph. This is a 5-year average and see that this is, we're talking about a pretty moderate place to grow wine. It's not a very hot and dry area of the Golan Heights. And if we looked at minimum VPD, we get, even during the summer, we have cool, wet nights. So we reach 0 pretty much every night. So 33rd parallel in the Golan Heights, but as we go up in elevation, it obviously gets colder. And according to the law of bioclimatics, the elevation would translate into a climate of more between the 37th and 45th parallel. So in terms of what that means for harvest, between our different elevations and varieties, we have quite a long harvest. We normally harvest 30% of our fruit in August, 40% in September, 30% in October. So 14-week harvest would be pretty typical, but 12 to 17 weeks, depending on the vintage. I mentioned that we have basalt soils, but volcanic soils, but we did a big survey of soils in the Golan Heights 13 years ago now, and we have identified 5 distinct types of volcanic soils. One is tuff-based, 2 are basalt-based, but they're different, and 2 are different kinds of mixes of tuff and basalt. And so that was a map, sorry about that. That's a map of the Northern Golan Heights. Here you can see the cinder cones. And so we know for each vineyard block exactly what soil type. And of course, we have a lot of climate data due to our climate stations. So our philosophy is pretty simple. We're at the 33rd parallel, high elevation vineyards, volcanic soils. So we're striving to grow independent, balanced, sustainable vineyards that produce fruit with a lot of personality. What that personality is, obviously, is an expression of the place. And then try to find a way to make wines, authentic wines that reflect the character of those vineyards and of our terroir. I said sustainable, and sustainability is a very important issue for us. Here's a picture of barrel cellars and bottling and case goods completely covered with solar cells. We've, in the past years, lowered our carbon footprint quite dramatically. 2020, 2/3 of our electricity from solar, and now wind turbines are being erected in the Golan Heights. So hopefully from next year, we'll be completely solar or wind powered electricity. Obviously, an important part of sustainability are the vines that you plant. And we have our own propagation block. We have 2 vineyards inside insect-proof netting where we grow the wood to make grafts for planting. And this is our nursery. So ever since 2011, any vine that we plant has been produced by ourselves, and we also sell vines to other producers. We also, in 2017, became the first vineyards to become certified sustainable. So all the vineyards that we directly manage are certified for sustainable wine growing. And any of our wines that have 85% of fruit coming from certified sustainable vineyards will have this logo on the back label. So that is a very quick overview. I hope I kept it close to 8 minutes. Thank you for your time and attention. Be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Victor. Very interesting, fascinating. Victor, I've got one question. How high are your vineyards? How high are they?
So from 400 meters in the southern Golan and that's 600 meters above the Sea of Galilee, because the Sea of Galilee is at -200 meters. So you change dramatically in a 20-minute drive from quite tropical conditions to quite moderate conditions going up in that elevation. And then our highest elevation vineyards are a bit over 1,100 meters.
Wow. And I think that is changing the character. Yes, I think the plant, the grape, is changing depending on which level it's growing, correct?
Yeah, we really think of the Golan Heights as pretty much three distinct areas. So the southern Golan, which is older soils, warmer, the mid Golan, which are younger soils, cooler, and then the quite cooler northern Golan.
Can't wait one day to go to Israel and have a close look at this vineyard. Thank you very much, Victor. The next winemaker is also a master of wine, an MW. It's Aaron Pick. He discovered his passion for wine during his stay in Mayen in Germany, and while taking a day trip to the steep vineyards of the Mosel nearby, he discovered his passion for wine. By the way, I was born in Mayen, so there is no wine in Mayen, but nearby. Aaron Pick completed his bachelor degree in viticulture and enology with the highest honor of the University of California in Davis. He is winemaker at Judean Hills Estate Winery, Thora Vineyards. And Aaron, fair and green is part of your philosophy, isn't it?
Yes. First, thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm very honored being here. Yeah, Fair and Green is a company, a German company that helps us with the sustainability program that we want. Victor talked a lot about this sustainability, and we have the same philosophy. And I would like to show you some photos of the vineyard and area and talk about the Judean Hills. I love Israeli wine. I believe in them, and it's great that we have the option here to talk about them. So Judean Hills is an area that is in the middle of Israel. You will talk about today about three regions. One is the northern Israel, Golan Heights. Judean is in the middle of Israel, between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And the next one is going to be in the south of Israel. Ran Goldwasser talked about it. We have today about 250 hectares of vineyards in the area, which is not a lot. It's much less than the Golan Heights, but I believe it's one of the most important regions in Israel. It's 25 years ago, there were almost zero planted with vines. I'm talking about the hills, the high elevation vineyards. Mid-90s, we began planting. We were one of the first ones, the winery. And today, almost 100% of the agriculture area is planted with vines. So it's from 0 to 100% in 20-something years. It's quite impressive. The topography is, again, in the center of Israel. You see in between the Mediterranean Sea on the left and the Syrian African Rift, which is in the Dead Sea, the lowest point on Earth. We have 0 meters elevation on the sea, and the Judean Hills, our vineyards are about 600, 700 meters above sea level, quite in the middle. Why is it important? Because we see that in order to get, Victor talked about it a bit also, but when we get higher on elevation, we get cooler summers, cooler nights, in my point of view, a better climate for vines. So this is a photo of the vineyards from above. This is about 1/3 of our vineyards. You can see the reason we have only 250 hectares in the region is that we're surrounded by natural reserves, not a lot of area to plant vines. But I don't know if you can see it on the hills. There are old terraces. People estimate that about 50% of the area was with terraces for agriculture, for hundreds or some of them probably thousands of years old. So agriculture was very important in the past, vines as well, and we know that because of the vine presses in the area. Today, some of the terraces that we see are natural reserves, so we can't plant any vines, but we try to plant wherever we can. There's a big demand for planting vines in the area. This is from another view. This is looking north. Neatly planted vines in between the natural reserves. So I won't talk a lot about sustainable viticulture in 8 minutes, but the point is to minimize our resources. In one hand, we have disadvantage compared to European wineries. So we have to irrigate. I'm sure that some European vineyards will have to irrigate as well in the next few years because of climate change. But we have to irrigate in most of our area because we have almost no soil, very shallow soil, and the rain is mostly during the winter. So we don't have any water reserves in the soil, very low water holding capacity. So we usually irrigate not a lot, but we irrigate a few times a year. So of course, irrigation is putting some resources. We have in the winery to put some energy to cool the cellars during the summer and also sometimes during the winter, not like in Europe. On the other hand, the disease, the health of the disease stress of the vines is very low. Compared to Europe, some of the classic places, we don't have to spray a lot. So it's quite, let's say, quite easy in the vineyard to be sustainable. Climate, this is, I showed, Victor has, Victor in the Golan Heights has snow, I think almost every year. In the northern part of the Golan Heights, we have every 3 or 4 years, but Mediterranean climate, as Victor said, quite nice, not too warm climate during the summer, and quite cool, not too cold winters. So I think if I have to summarize what is different between our area and the European, northern part of European area in regards to viticulture, I say that in my philosophy, we have to get away from radiation. As you know, the best, I start getting into wine once visiting the Mosel Valley. And what you see there, all the best vineyards are pointed towards the south. They're looking for the sun. And in Israel, we're trying to get away from the sun. So I believe that the best plots are north facing. And this is a photo of a plot, a Chardonnay, a white variety, that we, after veraison, during the last weeks of ripening, we put shade on the grapes in order for the to retain acidity, retain freshness, not to get into these tropical flavors that we sometimes see. And I think it's very important in our style of wine for the winery. Not all winemakers think so, but for our winery, it's very important. This is, I think, a couple of years ago. You see Chardonnay during the early stages. We're going to be at this stage in about 4 or 5 weeks. And the nets, we put them towards the bunches after veraison. This is a photo of old terrace. The vineyards are filled with old terraces. I don't know how old they are, but some estimate that the oldest could be 2,000 years old. This is a photo of the specific terroir. Unlike Golan Heights, which is more volcanic based soils, our soils are limestone based. They're a hint that they give us the clue that there was once an ocean there. So the Tethys Sea was in the area millions of years ago, and it left us this beautiful limestone, which some people think is very good subsoil for viticulture. We have a very, as you can see, very shallow soil of Terra Rossa soil, about 30 to 60 centimeters maximum, and subsoil of limestone, which is not too hard for the roots. This is, again, fossils that we find on top, actually, not inside, but on top of the soil. quite amazing fossils, millions of years old because of the Tethys. We harvest during the night, again, to retain the fruit fresh. This is, we put the people who come and to harvest put headlamps and get the coolest fruit they can. During the nights in August, where we have a much shorter harvest than Golan Heights. We harvest only 130 tons, much less than the Golan Heights. It's about 3 to 4 weeks. During August, so usually at night, it's about 18 to 20 degrees, depends on the vintage. We like to keep it that way and not harvest during the day and get 35 degrees or 32 degrees. This is Chardonnay harvested in 2016 vintage. As you can see during harvest, very clean, very green, which is the way I like it. You don't see any sunburns, and it helps the acidity and the freshness of the wines to retain the style of the winery. Varieties in our winery, I don't believe in monovarietals wines. We have all the wines are blended wines. I think it gives us much more possibility to produce complex and interesting wines and unique of the area. I think that if Sagi talked about the revolution of the Golan Heights winery in the early 80s to prove that a great wine could be made in Israel, I think our generation objective is to find the character of wine, the style of wine we want to make in Israel. And it takes, of course, a long time and trial with different varieties. Most of the red wines, I mean, all of the red wines are blends of Syrah and Bordeaux varieties. Syrah and Bordeaux varieties, which is, I think, very nice for our climate and soil. This is, the winemaking is not very unique. Maybe today barrel aging is quite unique compared to amphoras, but we're quite traditional, so we do it the traditional way. These are the 5 wines we produce, 2 whites, 3 reds. As I said, all of them are blends, and hopefully some of you can taste them wherever you are.
Fascinating. You talked about about an Israeli style of wine. If you would have to describe a typical Israeli wine style, how would you describe it then?
Wow, this is a question I cannot answer in a few words, but of course, I think to answer it in a serious way, I think it's in process, because today we have about 40 years of making good wine in Israel, and about, let's say, 50 to 100 commercial wineries from very different terroir, very different varieties. And I think each winery still has their own goals of the style. But I do see that in each region there is we getting together to have a regional character of the wines. We see that in tasting, and maybe other winemakers can comment on that, but I think the Golan Heights and Galilee are a lot of many times very fruit driven and very high concentration. And the Judean Hills, sometimes it's more on the mineral side and elegance, in my mind. And Eran can talk more about the south of Israel.
Okay, thank you very much, Aaron. Last winemaker who is going to talk to you is also an Aaron. It's our Aaron Goldwasser. He studied enology at the University of Adelaide, and he worked as a winemaker's assistant at the Salitage Winery in Western Australia. Upon his return to Israel, Aaron joined the Carmel Winery. We heard about that earlier. And from there, he moved on to Yatir Winery, where he is now in charge of the vineyard and the wine production process. Aaron, your vineyards are not far from the Negev desert. Do you need a lot of water for the wines?
Yes, we do. We need a lot of water for the vineyards, but a lot, you know, is relative. It's much less than apple trees and cherries and apricots or citrus groves. So it's quite logical to plant vineyards in that region. Almost everywhere in Israel, people need to irrigate the vineyards. You can do it the old way without irrigation in deep valleys. And in places with more than, I would say, 350 millimeters of rain each year. But let me touch more on the subject of growing in the challenging conditions of an arid area or a semi-arid area or the edge of the desert, as you said. I'll start with a map, which is called a phytogeographic zone map. And this is basically looking at the botanical aspect of geography. And you can see that most of Israel is in the Mediterranean zone, and both Tzor'ah and Golan Heights. And most of the vineyards in Israel and the wineries are growing in this Mediterranean climate, which is, as Victor said, quite similar to what you will see in Europe. But then we have another interesting zone, which is the Irano-Turanian zone. And this is a zone which is surrounded by desert in all other aspects, where you cannot possibly grow grapes. It is a zone where grapes do not grow naturally, but it is a zone that we know from history, people used to grow grapes there. We see the wine presses, we have archaeological evidences that people used to grow grapes there. They grew grapes there because they could and they wanted. It was not natural, but it was possible. And in my short presentation, I would like to touch on the prerequisites of what you need to do to be able to grow grapes. And can you even hope to get some quality grapes and quality wines in that region? So we move on. And in that little picture, you can see a vineyard that we are currently buying grapes from. In the deep reaches of the desert, and talking a little bit about the advantages that you can get if you go into that trouble of growing grapes in such a region. So first of all, because of the very little rainfall we get in winter, usually in the order of 100 millimeters, you can very easily control the vigor of the vines. If I would say one of the two biggest challenges of grape growers in Europe is to try and control the vigor of the vines. They're doing some green harvesting and hedging and all kinds of manual mechanical manipulation to control vigor and have a balanced vine. Here, you almost don't need to do that. You can just control the growth of the vine with irrigation. And the other challenge of grape growers in the northern hemisphere is disease pressure. We have all kinds of fungal diseases that are encouraged by humidity, and many people need to spray for that. So for desert grape growing, this problem is almost non-existent. Because the growing season is sunny, with no chance of rain, you can very easily reach phenolic ripeness and have grapes with a lot of flavor and color. And rainfall during harvest is not an issue. You can be very flexible in deciding your vintage date. But of course, some very serious disadvantages. The main one, as you touched before, was insufficient water to support even the basic vine growth and vitality. If you don't irrigate, you can't grow grapes. The vines will die. The other thing is the excess of sunshine and evaporation can delay the ripening. Where in Northern Europe, mostly sunlight is a limiting factor and heat is a limiting factor for ripeness. In Israel, evaporation and heat are becoming a limiting factor for ripeness because the vines just shut down at the heat of the day. The stomatas close in order for the vines not to lose water, and then the vines cannot photosynthesize, and the process of accumulating sugars and flavor and color can stop. And you can lose a lot of acidity and aroma in the process of bunches being exposed to heat and sunlight. So there are a few steps that we need to take and things that we need to have to be able to grow quality grapes. Obviously, we need to have a water source. And then we need to have a site, to choose a site with a high elevation to get cooler nights and cooler evenings and cooler mornings, and have as a bigger part of the day as we can with the lower temperatures. Soil selection is also very important because a lot of the soil in the desert is wind-blown sand that has deposited. We call it loss. And you can also find this type of soil in Northern Europe coming from glacier activity. That's just an anecdote. But for us, this type of soil is very challenging because it usually is very saline. So you will need to find a site that is not saline. We can protect the bunches and the soil from excess radiation by having a big sprawling canopy, something like a bush vine that can shade the undervine soil and the bunches and keep them a little bit cooler. And then things that we can do towards harvest is just harvest early. I think in this type of weather, there is no point for waiting for a long time. We need to keep as much freshness and fruitfulness in the berries. Something which is crucial is choosing the right grape varieties, because if you're gonna have, continuing from what I said before, if you're growing a grape like Cabernet Sauvignon, which is very late ripening, so you won't be able to harvest early. On the other hand, if you go for something like Syrah or Chardonnay for the white grapes, you will have maturity in July or the beginning of August, so you can harvest before the big heat of August. And also, I think it's better to choose varieties with thinner skins, because these varieties usually have a less problem of phenolic maturity, and you can safely harvest them a little bit earlier, have the fruit freshness, but on the other hand, don't have the unripe tannins that you can get from thick-skinned grapes. How did the people 1,500, 2,000, 4,000 years ago manage to do those things? Because I said before that people used to grow grapes in these areas before they had the possibility for irrigation. Well, they had an ingenious system of channeling rainfall water that would, the very little rainfall that will occur in winter was channeled with a system of dikes and small channels from the hillsides into the valleys. And then the ratio was that you have, for 1 hectare of vineyard, you had 25 hectares of rainwater collecting area. And so they, in one hand, enrich the soil with the water, and on the other hand, this abundance of water will wash the salinity of the soil. And indeed, they were able to grow quite a lot of grapes and quite a lot of wine in this way. And you can see an aerial picture of one of our vineyards again, and it is built on ancient terraces. And we can see that the soil in this part of the vineyard is much less saline than the soil in the other parts that were not found in the past, because of this effect of washing off the excess salinity. So I talked a little bit about winemaking in the really arid and desert area, but I have to say that most of the grapes that here at the Yatir winery we are processing into wine does not come from the arid area. And please have a look at this map of rainfall in Israel, and you can see that this is the desert part of Israel, and then you have a line with 200 millimeters of rainfall, and this is the area that we grow grapes in for Yatir winery, and we are actually located right in this part of the country, and it's a borderline area between the desert and the Mediterranean climate. And I feel that growing grapes in this region allows us to benefit from the advantages of the desert with the low humidity and control of the vigor. But on the other hand, the disadvantages of the desert are much less felt here, because the soil is much deeper and more fertile and less saline. You get a little bit more rainfall, and also in winter we get snow sometimes, combined with a little bit higher elevation than the desert, up to 800 meters. We are able to get this type of vineyards, which look much more like Mediterranean climate vineyards. So closing our subject, I would say that it is possible to grow grapes in the desert. It is more challenging, but also possible to grow quality grapes in the desert for winemaking. You should watch your objective, because if you're trying to make a wine in a classic European style, big and structured, probably you won't be able to do it. And I think maybe in a way similar to what happened in the Northern Europe, where people pushed the boundaries of grape growing in areas like the Mosel or Champagne. You can hardly grow grapes there. It's not natural for grapes to grow there, but through human ingenuity and maybe thinking out of the convection or the orthodox ways, you can come up with superb wines. And we are probably in the beginning of this process for Israel, and I'm optimistic that we will make some interesting discoveries in the future. So that's about it for me. If you have any questions, I would be glad to answer.
Thank you very, very much, Aaron. Fascinating and interesting. I've never heard anything like it. Do you think that, especially because of the climate change, other regions of the world can learn from you?
Yes, actually people have started doing that. We had one group coming a year ago from Bordeaux to try and see what they can learn from us. One thing that they've seen and were quite impressed with was the way we are starting to bury the irrigation lines between the rows of vines. We don't just put them on top of the ground, but we bury them underground to try and minimize evaporation loss and increase the efficiency of irrigation.
Perfect. Sounds very interesting. Thank you very much, Aaron. And the General Secretary of FIGEF, Anne Meglioli, she is French, but she is living in Italy, is now reading out the questions, and we're looking forward to hearing answers. Please, Anne.
So yes, one question for Sagi. What is the importance of the kosher wine for Israeli people?
The importance of wine to the cultural importance of wine to Israeli people.
The
I
question
think I
wasn't
answered it.
precise, but yes.
Okay. As I said before, I think it's mostly to the religious people. Otherwise, to the Jewish religious people, of course, Muslims don't drink wine. Otherwise, it's a recreation drink, as in every place on the planet. There isn't anything special about it. People tend to talk about it more than drink about it, but that's a problem we should cope with.
The question was probably more on the kosher wine.
The kosher wines.
Yes.
It's a big issue. Most of the population, I would say, most of the Jewish population will drink kosher wine or prefer kosher wine to non-kosher wine. I can't really, it's a huge subject, but I'd say that most of the Israeli wine today is kosher, certainly by numbers, and small wineries, usually small wineries that are not non-kosher. Israeli wine isn't necessarily kosher, and kosher wine isn't necessarily Israeli because it's made all over the world. Anything else?
Okay. Then now I have a question for Victor. Do you use barrel made from oak from Israel? And if yes, what are the difference, or if you tasted them, what are the difference with the French oak barrels, mostly on aromas?
No, the type of oak that we have in Israel isn't suitable for making barrels. It's not we have what we call Mediterranean oak, so it's a shorter kind of oak tree. So all the barrels that we buy, unfortunately for us, because it's expensive, come from French. It's all French oak that we use.
So now I have another question. What is the point about phylloxera and ungrafted vines? Do you have an area where you have ungrafted wine?
I guess that could be a question for all of us. We don't have any of our vineyards planted on its own. So all of our vines are grafted, and it's actually, there's big differences between the areas of the winemakers that spoke today. So, but we do use rootstocks as a tool to make the vines suited to the site. So, and, I have to say that we heard a lot about irrigation, but, for us, we've been irrigating less and less and less over time, and we're promoting very deep rooting in our vineyards. So the idea is to have, I mentioned it in my presentation, but we don't have time to get into it, balanced vines. So if looking back now, I see that what we've been doing is going into a direction to have the vines be more independent, which means for us, because we don't have shallow soils normally, we have pretty deep soils with high water holding capacity, fairly heavy soils. So our need for irrigation is much less, I guess, than the other areas. And we want to promote vineyards that are as self-sufficient as possible. And the nice thing about that is that we see that we're getting the best results also from those vineyards.
Okay. Then I have a third question for you also. Do you have issue with ESCA? Is it a problem for you? And what are the solutions that you are using? Oh, it could be, all these three questions can be for every of you, but it was during your presentation.
You hear my dogs barking. ESCA is not a huge issue. I mean, we do have some. It's actually because it can be a huge problem in vine propagation. So we have to be very careful in the methods that we use in our vine propagation block and in our nursery to make sure that we don't promote ESCA in the plant material. But it's in the field, it's a pretty minor problem. And I hope it stays that way.
Yes. Now I have a question for Aaron Pick. Do you think there is a future for Merlot in the Judean Hills?
Question.
Why for?
Actually, today I have a secret. Ran Goldwasser visited me this morning, and I can quote him, and he said, "Maybe we do have a future for Merlot in the region." The results show that once you're using, again, this is my philosophy, but once you're using the varieties for blending, and each variety gives you a different aspect, a different color for the palette of colors, you can use Merlot as an excellent fruity, aromatics, quite sensual in the nose, maybe even a bit greenish to have some nice, very refreshing wine.
And 100% Merlot?
100% Merlots. It's a good question, because I think that Judean Hills' first wines got very high claimed and very high. Let's say people love them. I think were mostly 100% Merlot. So I think the Judean Hills started to get a name with Merlot. But and some wineries, including actually Tzora Vineyards, during the early days made 100% Merlot. But I don't think it's the future. It's funny because the wineries consultant for Tzora, Jean-Claude Berouet, who's was the technical director of Petrus for 44 vintages. And when he saw that we were planting Merlot, he almost kicked us out of the room. But because in his philosophy, he likes more cooler climate for Merlot, but the results show that there is a future for Merlot, for me, especially for blending.
Can you tell something more about Judean appellation? But perhaps we could then speak about all the appellation of Israel. So just few things, few touch about these special appellations.
Yes, so unfortunately, the maps that you saw today of the Israeli regions, you saw too many maps. And it's a for me, very strange and very sad situation in Israel, that the official current legal map is not satisfying. It's very old and doesn't tell the story of today. So there were a few, let's say, independent projects. One of them, and the three winemakers that are here were a part of it, was drawing a map of the Israeli current terroir, current vineyard plantings, done by the Israel Professional Enology and Viticulture Organization. We call it IPVO, Israel Professional Enology Viticulture Organization. It was done by winemakers and viticulturists. I think you saw, it wasn't very clear, but during Sagi's presentation. The most important issue is that what Victor said, there is a huge diversity of climate and soil in just very short distance. And it means that we cannot have only 1 or 2 or 3 appellation. We need about 15 different appellation. The number
too much.
Too much. Germany has 13 different appellation. And Israel, yeah, but it's amazing because Iran grows wine in the desert, and I grow on limestone, and Victor on volcanic, and so on. So it's very, very different especially in soil and also in climate. So I think in the next future, we'll see a more decent and current map, maybe in the next 2 or 3 years.
Okay. Then there is another question from journalist from FIGEV, and asking when will be the next trip of FIGEV press trip to Israel. say? I don't know. I
can say that we invite every wine lover and journalist to Israel. We're very open to speaking about what we learned in the last few decades. We have in our winery about 40% tourists coming in 2019. Of course, 2020 was totally different, but we hope to get back to 40 or 50 or 60%.
Yeah, then I will bring you 20 journalists from houses, no more.
I can add that most of the visitors, more than half of the visitors pre-pandemic that came to visit us also were non-Israelis. So there's a lot of interest in Israeli wines from outside of Israel.
It's so different for the different.
And interesting, just one word about wine consumption that Sagi talked about. From the numbers that we're starting to get, the pandemic in Israel seems to have increased the per capita consumption of wine.
Good.
I wanted to mention this because it's interesting. Many people started to drink at home, of course. And when you drink at home, you drink at low prices and you can afford yourself a better quality, a better bottle of wine. So this is one thing we see. If we don't see numbers going up, we do see the quality going up, and I hope it stays this way.
Yes, and, us too, in Italy, us too.
Yes, and many people do come to the wineries now on Saturdays and on the weekends. We see lots of domestic tourism, wine tourism. People come, they buy a bottle of wine, some cheese, etc., and they just stay around, hang around the winery. And many wineries see this every weekend, as long as you're not kosher. Then you have to be closed. Most of the kosher wineries are closed on the weekends. But it's getting stronger and stronger, and with younger people.
Good.
I would just like to add that, as I mentioned, the fourth German-Israeli Wine Summit, which is actually an international wine summit, should have been last year, but due to the pandemic, it could not take place. I'm very hopeful that the pandemic will be behind us next year, and we will organize the wine summit next year in Tel Aviv, and you're all invited to come. And previous to the wine summit, there is a 1-week wine and cultural tour through Israel.
Thank you very much.
You did that very well, Anne. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, my president.
My general secretary. Yeah. By the way, when it comes to the pandemic and wine consumption, we noticed in Germany is a beer drinking nation mainly as well, but the beer consumption dropped dramatically, and we have breweries that have really big problems now, and the wine consumption increased. And so I think, drinking behavior seems to change during a pandemic. Anyway, we are more or less at the end of this very, very interesting wine talk. Any final comment from our speakers?
What I wanted to say, everybody is warmly invited to come visit us.
Okay, that are very good last words. Thank you very, very much. I would like to thank Anne for giving us all the questions, and I would like to thank Stephen Quinn for organizing the technical part. Thank you very much. And of course, I would like to thank all our speakers. René Salzman, thank you very much. And Sagi Cooper, not only being a FICHEF member, but he also made it possible that these 3 fantastic winemakers shared the time with us. And I would like to thank all the 3 winemakers, Victor Schönfeld, Aaron Pick, and Aaron Goldwasser. That was our wine talk for today, and we have taped it, and you will find all the wine talk from viticulture in Israel at our YouTube FICHEF wine channel. Thank you very much. Stay healthy, and bye-bye.